There are moments in international politics when nothing dramatic seems to happen on the surface, and yet the atmosphere shifts so sharply that experienced diplomats instinctively stop talking. Not because they lack arguments, but because the language they have relied on for decades suddenly feels unreliable. That kind of silence is never accidental. It usually means that something foundational has cracked, but no one is ready to name it yet. Over the past few days, the signals have been subtle, almost bureaucratic. No emergency summits, no declarations of rupture, no formal exits announced with fanfare. And yet the tempo changed. Meetings shortened. Phrases became careful. Statements that once flowed easily now arrived with qualifiers, footnotes, pauses. It looks like a trifle until you put it all together. When allies stop improvising and start reading from prepared lines, it usually means trust is no longer assumed. What makes this moment unsettling is not a single decision, but the way several unrelated moves suddenly align. Trade documents finalized faster than expected, long-stalled negotiations abruptly unlocked. Old grievances previously managed in private surfaced in public with an edge that felt unnecessary and therefore deliberate. At the same time, other doors quietly closed. Committees stopped sharing drafts. Calls that used to be returned within hours began to stretch into days. Officially, nothing has collapsed. The architecture is still standing. The treaties are still valid. The logos are still on the walls. But systems do not fail when the lights go out. They fail when participants stop believing the rules will protect them tomorrow. And that belief, once damaged, rarely announces its departure. There is also the question of timing. None of this is happening in isolation, and none of it is happening by accident. The sequence matters. Words were spoken that could not be walked back without loss of face. Responses followed that were measured but unmistakably firm. And then, almost immediately, paperwork appeared. Dense, technical, and final. Ink has a way of saying what speeches avoid. At this point, the system usually hesitates. It waits to see whether the shock will pass, whether the offending party will recalibrate, whether an apology or a clarification will restore equilibrium. But this time, something feels different. The reaction has not been emotional. It has been procedural. That is always more dangerous. Emotions fade. Procedures endure. Behind the formal language, a harder calculation seems to be forming. If assumptions about protection no longer hold, alternatives must be built. If access becomes uncertain, routes must be redrawn. If respect is no longer guaranteed, dependence becomes a liability. These are not ideological judgments. They are risk assessments. And once they start circulating through ministries and boards, they move faster than politics. The uncomfortable question is not who offended whom. That part is almost irrelevant. The real question is what happens when a central pillar is no longer treated as permanent, but as optional. When cooperation shifts from habit to choice. When loyalty is replaced by hedging. That transition rarely produces headlines at first. It produces contracts. Something has begun to reorganize itself, quietly, efficiently, without asking permission. And the people who understand what that means are not celebrating. They are adjusting their positions, lowering their voices, and making sure their options are no longer tied to a single center of gravity. This is where the main thing begins. Not with a crisis, but with a recalibration. And once that process is underway, it does not stop because someone asks it to. It stops only when the system finds a new balance, or when it fails trying. From that point on, the movement stops being symbolic and becomes mechanical. The language shifts from reassurance to implementation. What had been discussed as a contingency begins to appear as schedules, clauses, timelines. This is the phase where the system shows how it actually works, stripped of rhetoric. The first mechanism is substitution. When a partner becomes unpredictable, you do not confront them directly. You replace their function. Trade is rerouted not as punishment, but as insurance. Supply chains are remapped not to make a statement, but to reduce exposure. On paper, this looks like diversification. In practice, it is a quiet vote of no confidence. No one announces it because announcements invite retaliation. Instead, the adjustment is framed as efficiency, modernization, resilience. Harmless words that hide decisive intent. The second mechanism is insulation. Sensitive discussions start happening elsewhere, not because the excluded party is hostile, but because it is volatile. Intelligence sharing narrows. Strategic planning migrates into smaller rooms. Multilateral formats begin to fracture into inner circles, where alignment is assumed rather than negotiated. This is where alliances hollow out from the inside. The shell remains, but the substance relocates. At the same time, there is a recalculation of risk that goes beyond economics. Defense planners stop assuming automatic backing. Legal teams begin stress testing treaty language. What once functioned on trust is now interpreted literally, line by line. That is always a sign of decay. Systems designed to run on shared understanding were never meant to survive hostile readings of their own rules. What makes this phase especially destabilizing is that it feeds on itself. Each adjustment reinforces the next. As routes are redrawn, leverage shifts. As leverage shifts, incentives change. And as incentives change, old compromises start to look irrational. Why absorb costs for a partner who may not reciprocate? Why delay agreements waiting for consensus that no longer materializes? This is also where personal politics give way to institutional memory. Individual leaders can be replaced, their statements can be reinterpreted, but bureaucracies remember exposure. They remember losses incurred because assumptions failed. Once that memory settles in, it shapes behavior long after the original trigger is forgotten. The system begins to protect itself from the very structure it was built around. Another detail often overlooked is speed. These transformations appear sudden only to outsiders. Internally, they move with alarming efficiency. Drafts that once stalled for years are completed in weeks. Objections soften, red lines blur. Not because everyone suddenly agrees, but because delay itself becomes the greatest risk. When uncertainty dominates, momentum becomes a defensive tool. At this stage, the break is still deniable. Officials can plausibly insist that nothing fundamental has changed. Cooperation continues. Summits still occur. Statements still reference shared values. But the operational reality is already diverging. Parallel systems begin to emerge. Quietly doing the work the old one can no longer guarantee. And this is the most dangerous moment, not when the rupture is declared, but when it is no longer necessary to declare it. When the system keeps functioning just without one of its former anchors. When exclusion is not enforced, but rendered irrelevant. What comes next is not yet visible in full, but the direction is clear. Once mechanisms replace trust and insulation replaces solidarity, reversal becomes structurally difficult. Because at that point, returning is no longer about reconciliation. It is about dismantling the alternatives that were built to survive without you. From here, the consequences stop being abstract and start pressing into daily decision-making. Not as headlines, but as constraints. Budgets tighten where access narrows, timelines stretch where certainty disappears. Projects that once assumed automatic alignment now carry contingency clauses, exit ramps, silent alternatives. This is what a point of no return looks like in practice. Nothing dramatic breaks, but everything becomes conditional. Markets respond before politicians do. Capital dislikes ambiguity more than hostility. When predictability erodes, it moves, not loudly, not all at once, but persistently. Investment flows follow the new routes that were quietly prepared earlier. Insurance premiums rise on assumptions that used to be free. The cost is not announced. It is absorbed, distributed, normalized. By the time it is noticed, reversing it would require more stability than the system can credibly offer. Strategically, the shift is even colder. Defense planning begins to assume delays where guarantees once stood. Response times are recalculated. Scenarios are rewritten with gaps where certainty used to be. This does not mean abandonment. It means hesitation. And hesitation in deterrence is indistinguishable from weakness. At this point, the system usually fails, not because it collapses, but because it cannot move fast enough when speed becomes decisive. There is also a psychological threshold being crossed. Once partners internalize the idea that reliance is dangerous, cooperation becomes transactional by default. Every request is weighed, every concession priced. Trust, once broken at scale, does not regenerate organically. It requires sustained proof, and proof is expensive, especially when alternatives already exist and are functioning well enough. The most unsettling aspect is how little agency remains at the center. Decisions made earlier, framed as leverage, now operate in reverse. Pressure produces adaptation. Adaptation produces independence. Independence removes leverage altogether. At that stage, even a complete change in tone cannot restore what has been structurally replaced. The system no longer needs reassurance. It has already learned how to operate without it. What follows is not isolation in the theatrical sense. It is something quieter and more enduring. Being present, but peripheral. Consulted, but not essential. Included, but no longer central to outcomes. The room is still open, but the agenda is written elsewhere, earlier, by people who no longer wait. There are scenarios in which this stabilizes into a new equilibrium, a colder, narrower role. There are others in which the gaps widen under stress, exposing failures that were masked by scale and momentum. None of those paths end with a clean reset. Systems remember too much for that. The uncomfortable truth is that this did not begin with a single decision, and it will not end with a single correction. What has changed is not policy, but expectation. And when expectations shift at the systemic level, history rarely offers refunds. The question now is not whether the old order can be defended. It is whether the new one, already taking shape, will leave space for return, or whether the door that was never officially closed has, in practice, already been locked. At this stage, it becomes necessary to look at what usually stays outside the public narrative. Not the declarations, not the visible disputes, but the second-order effects that only appear when systems begin operating under permanent distrust. One of those effects is institutional drift. Large organizations are designed around assumed cooperation. When that assumption erodes, they do not collapse immediately. Instead, they begin to fragment internally. Departments start optimizing for their own survival rather than collective outcomes. Legal divisions gain influence over strategic ones. Risk officers begin overruling diplomats. This shift is subtle, but it changes how decisions are made. Caution replaces initiative. Redundancy replaces ambition. Over time, the system becomes slower, heavier, and less capable of decisive action. Another consequence is the redefinition of credibility. In the old model, credibility was anchored in history and scale. Past behavior mattered. Commitments accumulated weight over decades. In the new model, credibility becomes short-term and transactional. It is recalculated continuously, based on recent actions rather than long-standing ties. This favors actors who are consistent, even if limited, over those who are powerful but volatile. Once that recalibration takes hold, influence no longer flows automatically from size. It flows from predictability. There is also a generational layer to this shift. Younger policymakers, analysts, and executives entering the system now are forming their assumptions in a different environment. For them, the old guarantees are not memories, but case studies of failure. They are trained not to rely on them. That matters because systems are not only built by treaties, but by habits. When habits change, restoration becomes exponentially harder. Economically, the long-term effect is not just lost access, but lost relevance. Innovation follows networks. Standards are written by those who sit at the table early. When alternative blocks finalize technical, regulatory, and digital frameworks without a former central player, reintegration becomes costly. It is no longer a question of tariffs or quotas, but of compatibility. At that point, even favorable deals come with structural disadvantages baked in. Geopolitically, the risk multiplies during moments of stress. Crises expose assumptions brutally. When a shock arrives, financial, military, environmental, the question is not who has the most power, but who has the fastest coordination. Systems that have already rehearsed operating without a central node respond faster. Those still adjusting hesitate, and hesitation, again, is rarely forgiven by events. What is often misunderstood is that this process does not require hostility. It thrives on uncertainty alone. Even well-intentioned attempts to reassert leadership can accelerate the drift if they reintroduce unpredictability. Consistency, once lost, cannot be replaced by intensity. Loud corrections signal instability, not strength. There is also a cultural consequence that rarely gets discussed. When a system that once claimed universality begins to look parochial, its narrative power fades. Others stop defining themselves in relation to it. That is a deeper loss than market share or diplomatic standing. It is the loss of being the default reference point. And once that happens, recovery requires not persuasion, but transformation. All of this points to a future that is less dramatic than collapse, but more consequential than decline. A future where influence exists, but must be negotiated anew each time. Where presence does not guarantee impact. Where the center still speaks, but no longer sets the rhythm. And this is the final discomfort. The realization that nothing is officially over, yet nothing will ever function the same way again. The system has adapted to survive uncertainty. In doing so, it has made that uncertainty permanent.